My name is Thomas Hale. By profession, I am a journalist, though for many years my work has taken a quieter form than most. I record, with care and patience, the investigations of my close friend Edmund Blackwood, a detective whose reputation rarely reaches newspapers, yet whose abilities are known to those who seek answers where none seem to exist. This case did not begin with violence, nor with urgency. It began with a request so modest that it had already been dismissed by everyone else. One afternoon, as the pale light of early autumn settled over London, a gentleman arrived at our door. He was neither distressed nor agitated, but carried himself with the subdued unease of someone who had been politely refused and did not quite know where else to turn. His name mattered little at the time. What mattered was the way he spoke of his loss, carefully, without exaggeration, as though afraid that too much emotion might weaken his claim. A silver pocket watch, he explained, had vanished from his house during the night. There had been no break-in, no damaged lock, no forced window. The servants had found the house exactly as they had left it the evening before. Even the study, where the watch had been kept, appeared untouched. Only the drawer in which it rested was now empty. The watch itself was of no great monetary value. It was old, unfashionable, and unwound. For that reason, the police had shown little interest. They had inspected the house briefly, asked a few routine questions, and concluded that there was nothing to pursue. A missing watch, they said, was not a matter that justified time or manpower when more serious concerns demanded attention. The owner did not argue. He thanked them and watched as they left, taking with them the last official interest his problem would receive. It was only afterward, in the quiet of his undisturbed home, that the true weight of the loss settled upon him. The watch had belonged to his father. It had not been worn for many years, yet he wound it occasionally, listening to its slow, reliable ticking as one might listen to a familiar voice. Its absence left the house unchanged in appearance, but altered in feeling. Someone had been there. When Edmund listened to this account, he did not interrupt. He rarely did. His attention seemed fixed not on the missing object, but on the manner in which it had been taken. A thief who selects a single item of no obvious value, who leaves behind no sign of entry and disturbs nothing else, is not acting on impulse. Such a person knows precisely what they have come for. Edmund asked a few gentle questions, more about the house than the watch itself. How long it had been in the family? When it was last handled? Who knew of its existence? The owner answered as best he could, though it was clear that none of these details had seemed important until now. At last, Edmund agreed to visit the house. We arrived later that day, when the rooms were filled with a steady, diffused light and the quiet order of long habit. The study was as the owner had described it: shelves of books, a broad desk, a chair drawn back slightly, as though waiting for someone who had merely stepped away. The drawer from which the watch had been taken slid open without resistance, revealing nothing more than a shallow impression in the wood where it had rested. Edmund moved through the room slowly, without touching anything at first. He allowed the space to speak, as he often did, listening not for noise but for absence. Order, when preserved through an intrusion, becomes its own form of evidence. He observed the floor, the desk, the placement of objects that had not been moved. He paid particular attention to what remained untouched. To the untrained eye, there was nothing to see. To Edmund, the calm itself was informative. When we left the house, the owner looked relieved, though nothing had yet been discovered. Edmund told him only that the watch would be found, and that it would likely return to its place without explanation. He offered no promise of speed, only certainty. Later, as we walked back through the quiet streets, Edmund remarked that the simplest requests are often the most revealing. A crime dismissed as trivial is frequently one that has been misunderstood. He explained that a careful intrusion leaves behind more questions than a violent one, and that a person who takes only what they need is rarely motivated by greed. At that moment, I understood why this case had drawn his interest. It was not the watch itself, but the intention behind its removal. Somewhere within the order of that undisturbed house lay a reason, quiet, deliberate, and waiting to be uncovered. And so began an investigation that would unfold without haste, without pursuit, and without confrontation, guided instead by patience, memory, and the certainty that nothing taken without cause remains lost forever. The following evening arrived with a light, persistent rain that softened the streets of London rather than disturbing them. Edmund Blackwood seemed entirely unhurried as we made our way back to the house in Bloomsbury, though I had long learned that his calm never indicated uncertainty. It was simply the manner in which he allowed details to arrange themselves. The owner received us again with quiet courtesy. I noticed that he moved through his own home with a faint hesitation, as though the knowledge of an unseen presence lingered in the air. He led us once more into the study, closing the door gently behind us, leaving the room to its habitual stillness. Edmund did not approach the desk immediately. Instead, he remained near the center of the room, letting his gaze travel slowly across the shelves, the walls, and the floor, as though reacquainting himself with a space that wished to be understood on its own terms. Only after this unspoken survey did he step toward the desk. He asked the owner to open the drawer himself. The request was deliberate. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing the shallow hollow where the watch had rested for years. The absence felt oddly precise, as though the object had been lifted with care rather than removed in haste. Edmund leaned closer, his attention focused not on the emptiness itself, but on its edges. He asked when the drawer had last been cleaned. The owner explained that while the study was dusted regularly, the interior of drawers was rarely disturbed. Edmund nodded slightly, accepting this as confirmation rather than explanation. He asked next whether the watch had been kept loose or wrapped. The owner replied that it had rested in a soft cloth pouch, also missing. This detail seemed to settle quietly into Edmund's thoughts. At his request, a candle was brought into the room. Edmund held it low, allowing the flame to skim the surface of the drawer's interior. In the angled light, faint traces emerged. Dust had gathered undisturbed in the corners, yet along the back panel ran a narrow band where the surface had been smoothed by careful contact. The movement had been controlled, neither hurried nor clumsy. The drawer had been opened more than once, not to search, but to confirm. Edmund asked whether the servants had handled the drawer after discovering the watch missing. The owner admitted that the housekeeper had opened and closed it twice, hoping it might reappear through simple error. Edmund accepted this calmly, noting the timing without judgment. When the room was quiet again, Edmund opened the drawer himself, slowly, and listened. Drawers, he once told me, have their own language. This one moved with the ease of familiarity, its rails bearing no strain. He closed it and opened it again, his expression unchanged. Only then did his attention shift toward the window. It overlooked the street below, its view softened by curtains and age-old glass. Edmund asked whether it had been opened recently. The owner said it had not since summer. The latch was old but secure. Edmund examined the frame without manipulating it, his gaze tracing the join where would met glass. There were no marks of force. Yet near the lower edge, the paint showed a slight, repeated where that seemed too deliberate to be dismissed as age alone. He asked whether anyone in the household had noticed unusual sounds during the night. The owner shook his head. The street had been quiet. Nothing had drawn attention. Edmund nodded slowly, as though this absence of disturbance confirmed something already understood. As we left the house and stepped back into the damp evening air, I asked whether he believed the watch had been taken by someone known to the owner. Edmund did not answer directly. He said only that the watch had not been taken as an object of value. It had been taken as a gesture. And with that, I sensed the case settling into its true shape. The house had been entered without disruption, the drawer opened without haste, the watch removed without greed. What remained was not damage, but intention. The house had not been disturbed. That, Edmund believed, was the clearest sign that something deliberate had passed through it. The following days passed without visible development. though I knew from experience that such stillness often indicated progress of a quieter kind. Edmund Blackwood did not return immediately to the house in Bloomsbury, nor did he attempt to identify suspects through conversation or inquiry. Instead, he allowed the details already gathered to settle, confident that understanding would emerge through careful alignment rather than pursuit. When at last he spoke of the watch again, it was not to ask questions about who might have taken it, but about what the watch itself represented. He explained that objects kept for many years acquire meanings beyond their practical function, and that such meanings often dictate the manner in which they are treated, moved, or removed. The owner, when asked to describe the watch in greater detail, spoke not of its mechanism or appearance, but of its history. It had belonged to his father, a man of quiet habits who valued punctuality not as a discipline, but as a courtesy. The watch had accompanied him through decades of routine, marking not important occasions, but ordinary days. It had never been lost, never misplaced, and never repaired by anyone outside the family. Edmund listened carefully, noting the absence of dramatic association. This, he later explained to me, was significant. Objects involved in theft are often chosen for their value or symbolism. Objects chosen for personal reasons are taken with restraint. We returned to the house later that week, not to search, but to observe again. Edmund paid particular attention to the study at a different hour of the day, when the light entered the room at a lower angle and revealed subtle variations in surface and shadow. He noted how the desk cast a long reflection along the floor, and how the drawer's interior remained untouched by recent cleaning. It was then that he asked the owner to demonstrate how the watch had been stored. The owner retrieved a similar cloth pouch and placed it gently into the drawer, aligning it with the faint impression left behind. The pouch fit precisely. Too precisely. Edmund observed that the watch had not merely been placed there, but arranged with care, its position habitual and exact. From this, he concluded that whoever had removed it had known its placement intimately. Such familiarity could not be assumed. Edmund then turned his attention to the household itself. He asked not about recent visitors, but about former ones. Individuals who had once moved freely through the house, who knew its rhythms, and who would not need to explore its layout to reach the study without hesitation. The owner hesitated before mentioning a distant relative who had lived with his father many years ago. The arrangement had ended quietly, without dispute, though not without disappointment. The relative had been fond of the watch, often remarking on its craftsmanship and the patience required to maintain it. Edmund noted this without comment. That evening, as we walked through the streets near Bloomsbury, Edmund spoke of memory as a force more persistent than desire. He explained that theft driven by need is hurried, while theft driven by remembrance is careful. A person returning to reclaim something bound to their past does not behave like a criminal. They behave like a custodian correcting an imbalance. The manner of the intrusion now seemed clearer. The house had been entered not to take, but to retrieve. The care shown to the drawer, the absence of disturbance, and the selection of a single object all pointed to a motive rooted in personal history rather than opportunity. Edmund did not yet act on this understanding. He believed that confirmation would arise naturally, without confrontation. A person who takes such an object rarely intends to keep it hidden. The watch, having been carried through years of routine, would continue to influence the behavior of its holder. He remarked that the watch would be wound again. Time, once reclaimed, insists on being measured. As he spoke, I understood that the investigation had shifted from the physical space of the house to the quieter territory of memory and attachment. The solution would not be found through doors or windows, but through the patterns of a life that had once revolved around a small, steady instrument. The house remained undisturbed. Yet beyond its walls, something had been set in motion, guided not by greed or secrecy, but by the enduring pull of familiarity. And Edmund Blackwood, attentive as ever to such invisible currents, was already listening for the moment when the watch would make itself known again. In the days that followed our second visit to the house in Bloomsbury, Edmund Blackwood did not suggest any immediate course of action. This absence of urgency was not accidental. He believed that certain matters could not be approached directly without being distorted, and that time itself often served as the most reliable instrument of clarification. The owner of the house continued his routines with outward consistency, yet subtle changes became increasingly apparent to anyone attentive enough to notice them. He entered the study more often than before, sometimes without apparent purpose, sometimes pausing briefly beside the desk as though expecting to hear a sound that no longer existed. The drawer from which the watch had been taken was opened and closed with a quiet regularity, not from hope of discovery, but from habit resisting its own disruption. Edmund observed these behaviors without comment. He regarded them as indicators of the watch's enduring influence, for objects long embedded within daily routine continue to shape behavior even after their removal. Absence, when structured, becomes a presence of its own. When Edmund asked whether the owner had spoken to anyone beyond the police regarding the loss, the response came after a pause that suggested careful reflection. The owner admitted that he had written a letter to a relative who had once lived in the house many years earlier, a man whose departure had been quiet, though not entirely free of unspoken tension. The letter had not mentioned the watch directly. Instead, it spoke of memory, of old belongings, and of the strange unease that arises when something long familiar is no longer where it should be. The reply had arrived the following morning. It was brief, composed, and polite. It expressed sympathy, yet asked no questions and offered no reassurance. Edmund found this absence of inquiry noteworthy. A person unfamiliar with the circumstances would have sought clarification. A person already aware would not need it. He read the letter carefully, not for what it revealed, but for what it avoided. There was no denial, no curiosity, and no suggestion of surprise. Only neutrality, measured and deliberate. Edmund folded the letter and returned it to the owner without remark, though I could see that it had settled into his understanding with quiet significance. That evening, as we walked through the streets surrounding Bloomsbury, Edmund spoke at length about time as a form of structure rather than measurement. He explained that people who have ordered their lives around consistent temporal markers often struggle when those markers are removed. A watch does not simply tell time. It affirms continuity. It reassures its bearer that moments follow one another in a predictable sequence. To remove such an object is to interrupt not only possession, but rhythm. Edmund believed that whoever had taken the watch would feel compelled to restore that rhythm regardless of circumstance. A watch reclaimed for personal reasons is rarely left untouched. It is wound. It is checked. It is consulted. These acts, repeated without conscious thought, eventually shape movement and behavior. We did not return immediately to the house. Instead, Edmund suggested we observe the surrounding area not as investigators, but as ordinary pedestrians. He paid close attention to streets that allowed quiet passage, to small squares where one might pause naturally, and to benches positioned in places of low traffic and gentle light. In one such square, bordered by mature trees and shielded from the main road, Edmund stopped briefly. The space was unremarkable, yet calm. He remarked that it was the sort of place where a person might stand without purpose, winding a watch while appearing merely to rest. He did not present this as speculation, but as recognition. The investigation had now shifted away from physical intrusion and into the realm of repetition. Edmund was no longer concerned with how the watch had been taken, for that had already revealed itself through restraint and familiarity. What mattered now was how the watch would be treated in its new context. He believed that memory-driven actions could not remain concealed indefinitely. A person guided by habit will eventually reenact that habit, even when doing so risks exposure. The watch, once reclaimed, would continue to assert itself through routine. As we walked on, the city settling into evening around us, Edmund remarked that the most careful acts leave behind no visible trace, yet they alter behavior in ways that cannot be fully suppressed. The watch had been taken quietly, but it would announce its presence through repetition rather than noise. The case, though outwardly inactive, had entered its most decisive phase. Nothing more would be taken. Nothing more would be disturbed. Yet somewhere within the steady passage of days, a familiar gesture would repeat itself, and in that repetition, the truth would begin to surface. The following week unfolded without visible incident, yet Edmund Blackwood regarded this absence of movement not as a delay, but as confirmation that the case had entered a phase governed by routine rather than impulse. When an action is driven by memory, he often said, "It does not rush. It repeats." We continued our evening walks through Bloomsbury and the adjoining streets, not with the intention of searching, but with the quiet discipline of observation. Edmund did not fix his attention upon any single individual or location. Instead, he allowed patterns to present themselves naturally, confident that repetition would reveal what inquiry could not. It was during these walks that he began to notice subtle consistencies in movement. Certain figures appeared more than once at similar hours, not in a manner that suggested secrecy, but with the unself-conscious regularity of habit. Among them was a man of modest bearing who crossed the same small square on multiple evenings, often pausing near its center before continuing along a side street that led away from the main road. At first, there was nothing remarkable in this behavior. The square was a common thoroughfare, and many passed through it daily. Yet Edmund noted that this man's pauses occurred at nearly the same point each time, and lasted just long enough to suggest purpose rather than rest. He did not sit. He did not linger. He simply stopped, adjusted something at waist level, and moved on. Edmund did not alter our path to observe him more closely. He believed that attention, when applied too directly, often distorted the very behavior it sought to understand. Instead, he allowed our route to intersect naturally with the square at varying distances and times, gathering impressions without focus. Over several evenings, the pattern persisted. The man appeared shortly after dusk, paused briefly, and departed without haste. His movements were neither cautious nor bold. They reflected the ease of someone engaged in a familiar act, one that required neither concealment nor display. Edmund spoke little during this period. When he did, it was to remark upon how habits reassert themselves most strongly when a person believes themselves unobserved. A watch, he reminded me, is not consulted only to know the time. It is consulted to reassure, to confirm that one remains aligned with a rhythm long internalized. We did not approach the man. We did not follow him. Edmund wished only to confirm the persistence of the behavior. On the fourth evening, as the light faded more quickly than usual and the air grew cooler, the man paused once again in the square, this time standing beneath a lamp whose glow fell softly upon his hands. From a distance, Edmund observed the familiar motion. The man raised his left hand slightly, turned his wrist inward, and made a small, precise movement with his fingers. It was a gesture so ordinary that it might have passed unnoticed by anyone not prepared to see it. Winding a watch. The action was brief, economical, and unself-conscious. It was performed not as an object of attention, but as a continuation of habit. When finished, the man lowered his hand and resumed walking, his pace unchanged. Edmund did not react outwardly. He merely acknowledged, with the slightest shift in posture, that the behavior he had anticipated had now revealed itself. The watch, reclaimed for reasons of memory rather than gain, had returned to its rightful function within the rhythm of its bearer's life. In the evenings that followed, the gesture repeated itself with quiet consistency. Sometimes the man paused beneath the lamp, sometimes near the edge of the square, always briefly, always with the same restrained familiarity. The watch had become once more an instrument of routine. Edmund considered this sufficient confirmation. The watch had not been stolen to disappear. It had been taken to be used. Its bearer did not hide it away, nor did he attempt to conceal the habit it supported. Memory, once reclaimed, insists on expression. Only then did Edmund speak of the next step. He explained that such cases resolve not through confrontation, but through restoration. The watch, having completed its journey back into habit, would soon complete its return to place. A person who takes an object to restore balance often seeks, in time, to resolve the disturbance their action created. The case, though still outwardly quiet, had begun to move toward its conclusion. Time, once interrupted, had resumed its measured passage. And Edmund Blackwood, attentive as ever to the subtle authority of routine, prepared to allow the final act to unfold without interference. After Edmund Blackwood had confirmed the return of habit through repeated observation, he did not immediately act upon that knowledge. He believed that recognition alone was insufficient, and that intention required time to complete its own course. A person who retrieves an object bound to memory often needs space to decide what must follow. The man we had observed continued his routine for several evenings thereafter. He crossed the same small square at approximately the same hour, paused briefly beneath a lamp or near the edge of the trees, and performed the familiar gesture with practiced ease. The motion never appeared hurried or concealed. It was simply part of his movement, as natural as adjusting a coat or brushing dust from a sleeve. Edmund did not change our position, nor did he attempt to shorten the distance between us and the man. He remained committed to allowing the behavior to unfold without interference. He explained to me that decisions rooted in memory often resolve themselves when left undisturbed, while decisions forced by pressure tend to harden into resistance. As the days passed, subtle changes began to appear. The man's pauses grew slightly longer. His posture, once neutral and efficient, now carried a faint hesitation. At times, after winding the watch, he remained standing for a moment, his attention unfocused, as though listening inwardly rather than to the sounds of the street. These intervals were brief, yet meaningful. Edmund regarded this shift as significant. He explained that when a routine begins to feel heavy rather than reassuring, it signals the emergence of reflection. The watch, once reclaimed to restore continuity, was now prompting consideration of consequence. The man had corrected an imbalance, yet another imbalance remained unresolved. We returned to Bloomsbury during this period, not to the square, but to the street on which the original house stood. Edmund wished to observe whether the man's movements showed any inclination toward the place from which the watch had been taken. On 2 separate evenings, we noticed a deviation. The man approached the street at a distance, slowed, and then altered his route, choosing a parallel road instead. He did not stop. He did not turn back. He simply adjusted his course, as though acknowledging a destination without yet committing to it. Edmund said nothing at the time, but I understood that this avoidance was as informative as approach. A person who intends to return something does not rush toward that act. They circle it. They rehearse it. They measure themselves against it. During one walk, Edmund spoke quietly about ownership as a concept shaped by time rather than law. He said that objects inherited through use often carry obligations beyond possession, and that reclaiming such an object can feel justified until the weight of its history asserts itself. The watch, he believed, was no longer serving only the man who carried it. It was now exerting influence in both directions, pulling memory toward resolution. As the week progressed, the man's routine altered further. He still crossed the square, still paused briefly, but the gesture of winding the watch became less frequent. On one evening, he raised his hand and then stopped, lowering it again without completing the motion. Edmund regarded this interruption as decisive. The watch was no longer needed to reassure. The decision had been made. Edmund did not pursue the man, nor did he seek direct contact. He believed that resolution, if it were to occur, would do so without guidance. The role of the observer was now complete. Instead, we returned to the house in Bloomsbury once more, this time during the early evening. The owner received us with quiet gratitude, though there was a weariness in his manner that suggested the loss still pressed upon him. Edmund asked only that the study be left undisturbed overnight, and that no one enter it until morning. He offered no explanation. That night passed without incident. The following morning, the owner sent word. The watch had returned. It rested inside the drawer, wrapped once more in its cloth pouch, placed with the same precision as before. No note accompanied it. No apology was offered. Nothing else in the room had been moved. The house, once again, had not been disturbed. When Edmund heard this, he expressed no satisfaction. He regarded the outcome not as success, but as restoration. The object had completed its passage. The memory it carried had found equilibrium. As we walked later that day beneath a quiet sky, Edmund remarked that the most complete resolutions often leave no trace of their occurrence. A disturbance resolved with care returns a system to balance so gently that it appears unchanged. Time had resumed its ordinary rhythm. The watch had returned to silence. And the case, having reached its natural conclusion, required no further attention. In the evenings that followed our continued observations, Edmund Blackwood did not alter his routine, nor did he allow the case to press him toward resolution. He believed that when a matter is shaped by habit and memory, it resists haste, and that waiting is not an absence of action, but a form of alignment. The man we had seen in the square continued to pass through the same streets at familiar hours. His movements retained their quiet regularity, though small variations began to emerge, subtle enough that they might have been overlooked without deliberate attention. His pauses were no longer identical in length. At times they shortened, at times they extended slightly, as though his thoughts now occupied the space once governed by routine alone. Edmund regarded these variations as meaningful. Habit, he explained, is precise when unchallenged, but becomes irregular when reflection intervenes. The watch, once reclaimed to restore continuity, was now exerting a different influence. It had ceased to reassure and had begun to demand consideration. We did not speak of this directly. Our walks remained quiet, shaped more by shared observation than discussion. London, indifferent to the significance we assigned to its smaller rhythms, continued to offer its familiar sounds and silences. Footsteps echoed briefly and faded. Lamps glowed and dimmed. The air carried the faint scent of rain even on dry nights. During this period, Edmund chose to revisit certain locations connected only loosely to the case. He led our walks past old houses, narrow streets, and modest squares where time seemed to settle rather than pass. These were places where routine persisted without attention, where actions repeated themselves until they became indistinguishable from their surroundings. He explained that such environments often mirror the internal state of those who move through them. A person burdened by unresolved intention gravitates toward spaces that allow reflection without interruption. The man appeared again on several evenings, sometimes nearer to the square, sometimes farther from it. On one occasion, he paused, raised his hand toward his wrist, and then lowered it without completing the familiar motion. He stood for a moment longer than before, his posture suggesting not hesitation, but reconsideration. Edmund observed this without reaction. He did not shift his position or alter our pace. He believed that recognition, once established, must be allowed to mature. Decisions reached too quickly are rarely complete. As days passed, the case seemed to suspend itself between continuation and conclusion. Nothing progressed outwardly. Nothing resolved. Yet the absence of change felt deliberate rather than stagnant. Edmund remarked that such intervals are essential, for they allow intention to surface without pressure. He spoke quietly of objects inherited through proximity rather than ownership, and of how such objects often carry expectations that cannot be fulfilled through possession alone. The watch, he suggested, belonged not only to the past, but to the present in which it now found itself. Its presence required reconciliation, not concealment. We returned once more to the street where the original house stood, though we did not approach it directly. From a distance, Edmund observed the pattern of light within its windows, noting the times at which rooms were occupied and then darkened. The house had resumed its customary stillness, yet that stillness now carried a different weight. He believed that the man, wherever he was aware of this. Waiting, Edmund explained, is often misunderstood as passivity. In truth, it is the condition under which internal resolution occurs. A person who has acted out of memory must eventually confront the present. Until that moment arrives, no external intervention can replace it. The watch remained absent. Its silence now served a purpose distinct from its removal. It marked a pause, a space in which the act of return could form without compulsion. Edmund did not expect haste. He expected inevitability. As we continued our walks, the city gradually receded into background rhythm. Our attention narrowed to patterns too small to draw notice, yet too consistent to ignore. The man's movements grew less certain, his pauses less uniform. The routine that had once guided him now appeared to question itself. Edmund said nothing more. He understood that the case had entered its longest phase, one defined not by discovery, but by endurance. The outcome, whatever shape it would take, required time to become acceptable to all involved. The watch, though unseen, continued to exert its influence. And until that influence reached its natural conclusion, nothing would be forced, nothing would be reclaimed, and nothing would yet return to its place. The period of waiting continued longer than I had first expected, and in that duration I began to understand why Edmund Blackwood valued such intervals so highly. When a case does not advance through visible action, it advances inwardly, reshaping itself through reconsideration. What appears static is often undergoing its most delicate transformation. During these days, Edmund allowed himself to explore alternatives, not because he doubted his understanding, but because certainty, when unexamined, becomes assumption. He often said that a single explanation, no matter how convincing, must be allowed to stand beside others until it proves capable of remaining unchanged. We spoke quietly on several evenings, of possibilities that did not involve the man we had observed. Edmund considered whether the watch might have been taken briefly and passed on, whether its absence might have resulted from an attempt to protect it rather than reclaim it. He reflected upon the notion that memory can motivate not only retrieval, but concealment, especially when the past is burdened by regret. These considerations did not alter his manner, but they deepened his patience. He believed that by allowing alternative explanations to exist, the true one would eventually distinguish itself through consistency rather than insistence. We returned again to the square, though less frequently than before. The man appeared irregularly now, sometimes absent for entire evenings, sometimes present at unexpected hours. His routine, once steady, had lost its predictability. Edmund regarded this as neither confirmation nor contradiction, but as an indication that an internal negotiation was underway. On one occasion, we observed him pause beneath the familiar lamp, remain still for an extended moment, and then depart without raising his hand at all. His posture suggested resolution deferred rather than abandoned. Edmund noted that habits do not dissolve suddenly. They loosen gradually, releasing their hold in increments too subtle to measure directly. During this time, Edmund also paid renewed attention to the house itself. Though we did not enter it, he observed the exterior with the same care he once reserved for interiors. The pattern of light, the timing of shutters, the presence or absence of movement behind curtains, all were considered quietly. The house remained undisturbed, yet it no longer carried the same expectant stillness it had held earlier. He remarked that places, like people, change subtly when an imbalance nears correction. The owner, when encountered briefly during this period, appeared calmer, though a certain reserve remained. He no longer spoke of the watch with urgency, nor did he mention it unless prompted. Edmund interpreted this as a sign that anticipation had replaced anxiety. A person awaiting restoration often enters a state of quiet readiness, no longer pressing for outcome, but accepting its approach. As days passed, I found myself reflecting upon the nature of loss itself. The watch had been absent long enough to become part of the household's recent history, yet not long enough to be forgotten. Its absence now occupied a middle space, one defined by uncertainty rather than shock. Edmund believed that such a space is necessary for reconciliation, for it allows both possession and relinquishment to be reconsidered. He spoke of time not as a sequence, but as a weight that shifts. Objects associated with time amplify this effect, for they carry the illusion of control while reminding us of its limits. To reclaim such an object is to reclaim not the past, but the feeling of continuity that past once provided. The man we observed seemed increasingly burdened by this realization. His movements lacked the ease they once possessed. Even when he did not pause, his pace suggested preoccupation. Edmund noted that when routine ceases to reassure, it begins to demand resolution. Still, nothing was forced. The watch remained absent. The house remained whole. The city continued its indifferent passage. Edmund did not yet speak of return. He believed that the moment had not arrived, and that premature resolution would diminish the integrity of what was unfolding. The case, now extended beyond observation, had become a matter of internal balance rather than external correction. As we continued our quiet walks, I understood that the investigation was no longer concerned solely with a missing object, but with the quiet negotiation between memory and present necessity. The watch, though unseen, remained central not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. And until that representation could be reconciled without resistance, the case would remain open, suspended in the careful stillness Edmund valued above all else. By the time the case reached this stage, its outward simplicity had dissolved entirely. What remained was not a question of theft, nor even of return, but of endurance. Edmund Blackwood regarded endurance as one of the most revealing forces in human behavior, for it exposes the limits of habit more clearly than confrontation ever could. The man we had observed no longer appeared each evening. His absences grew longer, and when he did pass through the square, his movements lacked the quiet certainty they once held. He no longer paused with regularity. At times he slowed, at times he hurried slightly, as though uncertain of his own intentions. The gesture that had once defined his routine now surfaced only intermittently, and even then without completion. Edmund believed this to be the natural consequence of internal resistance. A habit reclaimed for reassurance will persist only so long as it serves its purpose. When it begins to produce discomfort, the mind seeks distance rather than repetition. During this period, Edmund chose to revisit earlier assumptions, not to dismantle them, but to test their resilience. He spoke of alternative motives again, this time with greater attention to emotional nuance. He considered whether the watch had been taken not to restore continuity, but to delay its loss. Objects inherited from the past often serve as anchors against change, and removing such an anchor can feel less threatening than confronting its eventual absence. This possibility, he admitted, complicated the matter. A person who removes an object to delay grief may struggle more deeply with the decision to return it, for return confirms finality. We observed the house in Bloomsbury from a distance once more. Its windows followed a predictable rhythm now, lights appearing and disappearing with renewed regularity. The study remained quiet. No servant entered it unnecessarily. The drawer was no longer opened absent-mindedly. The house, having adjusted to absence, no longer anticipated immediate correction. Edmund remarked that this adjustment was significant. When anticipation fades, resolution must arise from intention alone. On one evening, as we walked without purpose along a narrow street, Edmund spoke of the difference between concealment and avoidance. Concealment, he explained, seeks to protect an act from discovery. Avoidance seeks to protect the individual from acknowledgement. The man we observed was no longer concealing a habit. He was avoiding its implication. This distinction altered Edmund's understanding subtly, though not decisively. He believed that avoidance, when sustained, leads either to relinquishment or to confession of a different kind. The watch, if still carried, would now feel heavier, not as an object, but as a reminder of unresolved choice. The city offered no commentary on these developments. Its rhythms continued unchanged, indifferent to the quiet negotiation unfolding within one individual. Footsteps echoed briefly and dissolved. Lamps illuminated nothing of consequence. Rain came and passed without remark. We did not attempt to locate the man directly. Edmund refused to narrow the field prematurely. He believed that narrowing invites distortion, and that clarity emerges best when allowed to surface on its own terms. Instead, he spoke of timing. He explained that decisions rooted in memory often resolve themselves at moments of transition rather than during stability. A change in weather, a shift in routine, or an unremarkable interruption can provide the necessary distance for acceptance. He did not know when such a moment would arrive, only that it would. As days passed, the case seemed suspended between presence and absence. The watch had not returned. The man had not vanished. Nothing outwardly progressed, yet the tension underlying the situation had softened, as though resistance were slowly giving way to recognition. Edmund regarded this softening as essential. Resolution achieved through pressure leaves residue. Resolution achieved through acceptance leaves none. He spoke quietly of cases that never conclude because they are forced too soon, their outcomes marked by resentment rather than balance. He believed this case would not join them, for its pace had been governed by patience from the outset. The watch, wherever it was, continued to exist within a narrowing circle of meaning. Its role as an instrument of reassurance had diminished. Its presence now required justification. As we concluded one evening walk, Edmund remarked that the longest cases are often the simplest, for they ask not what must be done, but when one is ready to do it. The city grew quieter as night advanced. The house remained whole. The watch remained absent. And the decision, though still unspoken, continued to take shape, guided less by habit than by the quiet insistence of conscience. By this stage, the case had settled into a silence that felt deliberate rather than empty. Edmund Blackwood regarded such silence with respect, for he believed that it often marked the final distance a decision must travel before it can be completed. Nothing more needed to be discovered. What remained was the quiet acceptance of consequence. The man we had observed no longer passed through the square with any regularity. When he did appear, it was at hours that differed slightly from those we had grown accustomed to noticing. His movements lacked the former precision of habit. Even his posture suggested a shift, as though the certainty that once guided him had been replaced by something heavier and less defined. Edmund believed this change to be significant. He explained that when a routine is reclaimed for reassurance, it initially restores balance. When that reassurance fades, the routine becomes a reminder rather than a comfort. At that point, the individual must decide whether to abandon the object entirely or to return it to its original place. Lingering between these choices produces unease that cannot be sustained indefinitely. We continued to walk the same streets, not to observe the man directly, but to remain aligned with the rhythms that had shaped the case from the beginning. Edmund maintained that alignment was essential. A decision formed in quiet must be met with quiet, or it risks being distorted by interference. On several evenings, we passed near the house in Bloomsbury without stopping. From a distance, the house appeared unchanged. Its windows followed a consistent pattern of light and darkness. The study, though unseen, seemed to have resumed its former neutrality. There was no longer an air of expectation surrounding it. Edmund regarded this as a sign that the house itself had released its hold on anticipation. He spoke then of return as an act distinct from restoration. Restoration corrects an imbalance. Return acknowledges responsibility. The two are often mistaken for one another, yet only the latter resolves the internal conflict that drives such cases. The watch, he believed, had fulfilled its role as a corrective. It had reasserted memory, reminded its bearer of continuity, and then revealed the cost of that reminder. Its continued presence now demanded a decision that could no longer be postponed without consequence. During one of our walks, Edmund noted a subtle but meaningful absence. The man had not appeared for several evenings in succession. This absence did not suggest concealment. It suggested withdrawal. Edmund explained that when individuals approach resolution, they often retreat briefly from the behaviors that have defined them, creating space in which a final act can occur. He did not yet speak of return, but his attention had shifted. The case, once extended through observation and waiting, had narrowed again, not through elimination, but through inevitability. Edmund believed that when all alternatives have been considered and dismissed internally, action becomes unavoidable. The city offered no signal of this shift. Its sounds and movements remained consistent, indifferent to the quiet conclusion forming beneath them. The streets absorbed footsteps and released them again. Time continued to pass without acknowledgement. We did not see the man again that week. Edmund regarded this absence with calm certainty. He believed that the decision, once formed, often precedes its expression by a brief interval of withdrawal. During this time, the individual prepares not to act, but to accept the meaning of that act. The watch, wherever it rested, no longer governed routine. It now governed reflection. Edmund spoke quietly of how such cases end, not with confrontation or discovery, but with a return so ordinary that it nearly escapes notice. He believed that the most complete resolutions occur without audience, guided only by the individual's need to restore coherence to their own narrative. He did not predict the manner of return. He did not specify time or place. He believed that prediction would impose structure where none was required. The return, when it came, would follow the logic already established. As we concluded one evening walk, Edmund remarked that time itself resists being held indefinitely. Objects associated with time merely reveal that resistance more clearly. The watch, once taken to preserve continuity, had now revealed the impossibility of doing so without consequence. The case stood on the threshold of completion. Nothing further would be observed. Nothing further would be pursued. What remained was the quiet space in which an act of return could occur without witness, without explanation, and without disturbance. And until that moment arrived, Edmund Blackwood was content to wait, confident that time, once interrupted, always seeks its proper place again. By the time Edmund Blackwood considered the case to have reached its 11th stage, it had become clear that what we were observing was no longer the movement of events, but the gradual reshaping of absence itself. The watch had been gone long enough that its removal no longer felt recent, yet not so long that it could be dismissed as resolved. It occupied a space between memory and expectation, and it was within that space that the true weight of the matter now rested. Edmund believed that every unresolved act creates a vacuum that must eventually be addressed, not because the world demands it, but because the individual involved cannot remain indefinitely suspended within it. He often remarked that silence, when prolonged, begins to speak in subtler ways. It alters posture, interrupts routine, and introduces hesitation where none existed before. The man we had observed had not returned to the square for several nights. This absence, far from suggesting escape, suggested consolidation. Edmund explained that individuals approaching a final decision often withdraw temporarily from the environments associated with their uncertainty. They do not flee. They pause. They seek a neutral ground in which the implications of their choice can be faced without interruption. During this period, Edmund and I continued our walks through London, though their purpose had shifted. We were no longer observing a particular individual, nor were we tracing patterns of movement. Instead, we allowed ourselves to move through familiar streets without intention, trusting that alignment with the city's rhythm would preserve the integrity of the case. London, in its indifference, proved a patient companion. Streets filled and emptied without regard for significance. Lamps glowed, dimmed, and were replaced by others further along the road. The sound of distant carriages and footsteps blended into a continuous murmur that neither invited nor discouraged reflection. It was within this ambient continuity that Edmund found clarity. He spoke to me on more than one occasion about the distinction between resolution and relief. Relief, he explained, is the easing of tension. Resolution is the acceptance of consequence. The former can be achieved through avoidance. The latter cannot. A person who has taken an object bound to memory may feel relief upon possessing it again, but resolution arrives only when the implications of that possession are fully acknowledged. The watch, he believed, had already fulfilled its capacity to provide relief. What remained was the quieter, more demanding process of resolution. We did not return to the house in Bloomsbury during this time. Edmund felt that its involvement had temporarily concluded. The house, having absorbed the absence and adjusted to it, now existed in a state of quiet equilibrium. The drawer remained closed. The study resumed its former neutrality. The owner, having accepted uncertainty, no longer sought reassurance through repetition. This acceptance, Edmund noted, was essential. Resolution cannot occur when one party remains in a state of expectation. Only when expectation gives way to acceptance can balance be restored without disturbance. On one evening, as we walked through a street lined with modest homes whose windows reflected the low glow of interior lamps, Edmund spoke of objects that outlive their original context. He explained that such objects often become repositories of unresolved relationships, carrying within them the weight of what was left unsaid or unfinished. To reclaim such an object is to reopen that relationship, not with the past, but with one's own present understanding of it. The watch, though small and unremarkable in appearance, represented such a repository. Its steady ticking had once structured a life defined by routine and reliability. Its removal had disrupted that structure. Its possession, now transferred, had revealed the cost of attempting to restore what time itself had altered. Edmund believed that the man who had taken it was now confronting this realization. The watch, once a source of comfort, had become a question, not of ownership but of right. As days passed, the city's rhythm continued unchanged. Yet within that rhythm, Edmund detected a narrowing of possibility. He explained that when all alternatives have been considered internally, the remaining path begins to exert a quiet pressure. This pressure does not announce itself through urgency or distress. It manifests instead as a growing sense of incompatibility between action and conscience. The watch, wherever it rested, no longer belonged comfortably to its bearer. Its presence now required justification that could not be sustained indefinitely. We observed no outward sign of movement toward return. There were no messages, no inquiries, no indirect gestures. Edmund found this reassuring. He believed that returns preceded by explanation often lack sincerity. A return made quietly, without negotiation, carries greater weight. He spoke then of the importance of leaving space untouched. Intervention at this stage, he warned, would collapse the internal process prematurely, replacing acceptance with compliance. The outcome might appear similar, but its foundation would be weaker. Thus, we waited. Waiting, Edmund maintained, is not inactivity. It is restraint. It preserves the conditions under which resolution can occur naturally. To act too soon is to claim authority where understanding is required. The case now existed almost entirely within this restraint. There was nothing left to observe externally, no patterns to trace, no behaviors to interpret. All that remained was the gradual alignment of intention with consequence. As I recorded these reflections, I became aware that the true subject of the case had shifted yet again. It was no longer about a missing watch, nor even about its return. It was about the moment in which an individual accepts that memory cannot be reclaimed without cost, and that some objects, once removed from their original context, demand a decision rather than possession. Edmund Blackwood remained patient. He did not predict the outcome. He did not anticipate the moment. He allowed the space to remain untouched. And within that space, the case continued to mature, guided not by investigation, but by the quiet inevitability of conscience moving toward its proper conclusion. As the days continued to pass in quiet succession, I became increasingly aware that the case had entered a phase where change no longer announced itself through action, but through atmosphere. Edmund Blackwood often remarked that when a resolution draws near, it rarely arrives suddenly. Instead, the world around it begins to adjust in subtle ways, as though preparing itself to receive an outcome already decided elsewhere. The city itself seemed unchanged, yet certain details took on a different quality. Evening light lingered a little longer on familiar streets. Sounds appeared more spaced, less insistent. The rhythm of our walks remained steady, but their purpose had shifted from observation to acknowledgement. We were no longer waiting for information. We were allowing the final alignment to take place. Edmund spoke little during this period, though his silence felt deliberate rather than withdrawn. He believed that excessive reflection near the end of a matter could disturb its natural course. What had been understood did not require reinforcement. What remained unresolved would not be clarified through further analysis. On several evenings, we passed again near the square where the habit had once revealed itself so clearly. The space appeared ordinary now, its significance diminished by familiarity. People crossed it without pause. Lamps illuminated nothing of note. The absence of repetition itself became instructive. What had once been marked by routine had dissolved back into anonymity. Edmund regarded this disappearance of pattern as a necessary condition. He explained that when a habit has completed its function, it relinquishes its hold quietly, leaving behind no trace of its former authority. The watch, wherever it rested, no longer dictated movement. Its influence had shifted entirely inward. During this time, Edmund allowed himself to consider the house in Bloomsbury once more, though only in abstract terms. He spoke of places that have absorbed disturbance and returned to equilibrium without intervention. Such places, he believed, retain a memory of imbalance long after its resolution, not as tension, but as a subtle refinement of order. The owner, whom we encountered briefly by chance one afternoon, appeared composed. His manner lacked the quiet strain I had noticed earlier. He spoke of ordinary matters without reference to loss or expectation. Edmund observed this with interest, noting that acceptance had now replaced anticipation. This transition, he believed, was essential. A return, if it were to occur, required that the recipient no longer waited for it. Edmund reflected quietly on the nature of voluntary restoration. He believed that acts completed without witness carry a particular integrity, for they are guided solely by internal necessity. Such acts do not seek recognition or absolution. They occur because they must. The watch, in his view, had reached this stage. Its absence had fulfilled its purpose. Its presence, once reclaimed, had revealed its burden. What remained was the acknowledgement that possession alone could not resolve what memory had unsettled. As nights grew cooler, Edmund noted a subtle shift in his own expectations. He no longer spoke of inevitability with the same abstraction. His attention had narrowed, not toward a specific moment, but toward readiness itself. He believed that when readiness emerges, action follows without deliberation. We did not adjust our routines. We did not revisit the house. We did not seek further confirmation. The case, now shaped almost entirely by internal processes, no longer required observation. It required space. I found myself reflecting on the manner in which unresolved matters occupy attention long after their immediate relevance has passed. The watch had become such a matter, not because of its absence, but because of what that absence had revealed. It had exposed the persistence of attachment and the difficulty of releasing what once structured a life. Edmund believed that the final act, when it came, would not disrupt this understanding. It would confirm it. He spoke once, quietly, of how resolutions formed through patience tend to leave behind no residue. They do not demand explanation. They do not require acknowledgement. They settle into place as though they had always belonged there. The city continued its indifferent progression. The square remained unremarkable. The house remained whole. The watch remained unseen. Yet within this stillness, I sensed a narrowing of distance, as though an invisible threshold had been crossed. The case, having extended itself through waiting and reflection, now stood poised at the edge of completion, restrained not by uncertainty, but by timing. Edmund Blackwood did not hurry this moment. He trusted that what had been prepared through silence would arrive in silence as well. And so we continued to wait, not in expectation, but in quiet recognition that the final movement, when it came, would do so without announcement, altering nothing outwardly, and yet resolving everything that remained unsettled beneath the surface of time. By the time Edmund Blackwood considered the case to have entered its 13th stage, it had become clear that what remained was no longer uncertainty, but preparation. The kind that occurs quietly, without conscious acknowledgement, and reveals itself only through subtle shifts in attention. Nothing new had appeared, yet everything felt closer to completion. The city continued its ordinary course, though I sensed that Edmund listened to it differently now. His attention no longer moved broadly across patterns and alternatives. It rested instead upon moments of stillness, as though waiting for a particular alignment of time and place to present itself naturally. He believed that decisions formed through memory announce themselves not through urgency, but through readiness. We resumed our walks without deviation, following the same streets we had traced for weeks. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The air felt less expectant, less weighted. The waiting that had defined earlier stages had softened into a quiet awareness that nothing further needed to be encouraged. Edmund regarded this shift as essential. A resolution that arrives prematurely leaves behind the echo of force. One that arrives through readiness leaves nothing at all. On one evening, as we passed again near the house in Bloomsbury, Edmund paused briefly. He did not look toward the windows, nor did he alter his pace significantly. He merely acknowledged the place with the faintest adjustment of attention, as though recognizing that it no longer required observation. He spoke then of how decisions reach completion not when circumstances demand them, but when resistance dissolves. The watch, he believed, had already fulfilled every role it could play away from its original setting. It had restored memory, provoked reflection, and ultimately revealed the impossibility of reclaiming continuity without acceptance. The man who had taken it, wherever he now was, had likely reached the same understanding. Edmund did not speculate about his thoughts in detail. He believed that speculation at this stage served no purpose. What mattered was that the internal process had concluded, and that action, when it came, would be uncomplicated. We observed no sign of movement toward return. No messenger appeared. No indirect inquiry reached the house. Edmund found this absence reassuring. He believed that genuine resolution avoids ceremony. It seeks completion rather than acknowledgement. During this period, Edmund spoke briefly of the nature of quiet decisions. He said that the most meaningful acts are often those that leave no mark upon the world, altering nothing outwardly while correcting everything inwardly. Such acts rarely attract attention, yet they possess a permanence that louder gestures cannot achieve. The watch, once taken to preserve a sense of order, now demanded such an act. Its return, when it occurred, would not seek to undo the past, but to accept it. As days passed, the house in Bloomsbury continued unchanged. Its routines remained steady. The study remained closed and undisturbed. The drawer remained empty, though no longer expectant. Edmund regarded this neutrality as confirmation that the final act must originate elsewhere. He believed that return requires solitude. It must be completed without witness, free from the influence of observation or expectation. Only then does it restore balance rather than create a new disturbance. On one evening, Edmund remarked quietly that the case no longer required our presence. He did not say this as a conclusion, but as an acknowledgement that observation had fulfilled its purpose. The matter had passed beyond investigation and entered the domain of choice. We continued our walk without altering course. The city offered no signal. The streets remained indifferent. Time moved forward without pause. Yet within this continuity, I sensed that something had been set aside, not postponed, but prepared. The space left by the watch's absence no longer carried tension. It had become neutral ground, capable of receiving what might return without disruption. Edmund believed that when such neutrality is achieved, resolution follows naturally. The watch, having revealed the limits of possession, no longer required justification. Its return would not announce itself as correction, but as acceptance. As we parted that evening, Edmund said nothing further. He did not speculate on timing, nor did he anticipate the manner of return. He trusted that the decision, once fully formed, would express itself with the same restraint that had guided the entire case. The night settled quietly around the city. The house remained whole. The watch remained absent. And yet, beneath the steady passage of hours, a final alignment had taken place, unseen and unspoken, preparing the way for an act that would complete the case without altering its outward appearance, leaving behind no trace except the quiet restoration of balance where imbalance had briefly existed. The return of the watch did not announce itself through urgency or surprise. It arrived quietly, in the manner Edmund Blackwood had always expected, without witness and without explanation. In truth, nothing outwardly marked the moment as significant, and yet everything that had remained unresolved now settled into place. It was early morning when word reached us. The owner of the house in Bloomsbury sent a brief message, written without excitement or disbelief. He stated simply that the watch had been found. It rested inside the drawer of the study desk, wrapped in its familiar cloth pouch, placed with a care so precise that it might never have left. There was no sign of entry, no disturbance, no alteration to the room. The house, once again, had not been disturbed. Edmund received the news without visible reaction. He did not smile, nor did he express satisfaction. He regarded the outcome not as a success, but as a completion. The process that had begun with absence had reached its natural conclusion, guided not by intervention, but by acceptance. We visited the house later that day, not to investigate, but to acknowledge the restoration. The owner led us into the study, his movements calm and unhurried. The room appeared unchanged, its familiar order undisturbed by either loss or return. The desk stood as it always had. The drawer opened smoothly, revealing the watch resting exactly where memory expected it to be. Edmund did not touch it. He believed that once an object has returned of its own accord, it should not be examined as evidence. Its presence alone was sufficient. To handle it would be to reintroduce the question of possession, when what mattered now was balance. The owner, after a moment's hesitation, lifted the watch gently. He did not wind it. He did not open it. He merely held it briefly, as one might hold something that has completed a journey and no longer requires explanation. Edmund observed this without comment. He later explained that restoration achieved through voluntary return carries a quiet dignity. It does not seek acknowledgement, nor does it require forgiveness. It corrects itself and moves on. We remained only a short while. There was nothing left to consider, no detail requiring interpretation. The case, having resolved itself, no longer belonged to investigation. It belonged to memory, where it would gradually lose its edges and become simply another moment absorbed into time. As we walked away from the house, Edmund spoke once more of the difference between reclaiming and returning. Reclaiming seeks to restore what was lost. Returning accepts what has changed. The watch, he believed, had completed both movements, passing briefly through reclamation before arriving at return. The city, indifferent as ever, continued its routine. Streets filled and emptied. Sounds rose and faded. The quiet correction that had taken place within one unremarkable house left no mark upon its surroundings. The man who had taken the watch remained unseen and unremarked. Edmund did not speculate about his thoughts or circumstances. He believed that such matters were no longer relevant. The act of return had resolved what needed resolution. Nothing further could be gained through inquiry. Later that evening, Edmund remarked that the most complete resolutions are those that do not linger in the mind. They close gently, leaving behind no residue of tension or curiosity. The case, he said, would not trouble the owner again, nor would it trouble the one who had taken the watch. Both had reached a point of quiet acceptance. Time, once briefly unsettled, had resumed its ordinary rhythm. The watch rested where it belonged. The drawer closed without hesitation. The study returned to silence. In recording these events, I was struck by how little remained to be said. The resolution had not altered the world in any visible way. It had simply returned one small object to its place, correcting an imbalance that had existed only briefly and quietly. Edmund Blackwood regarded this as the ideal outcome. He believed that cases resolved without disturbance leave behind no need for memory to dwell upon them. They conclude, not with finality, but with continuity. As night settled over London once more, the house in Bloomsbury blended back into the city's fabric, indistinguishable from countless others. Nothing about it suggested that anything unusual had occurred within its walls. And yet, for a time, it had held a question. That question had now been answered, not through force or discovery, but through the quiet return of something that no longer needed to be held. After the watch had returned to its place, the days that followed passed without distinction. Edmund Blackwood regarded this absence of consequence as the final confirmation that the matter had resolved itself properly. A case that leaves behind nothing to reconsider has, in his view, reached its most complete conclusion. The house in Bloomsbury resumed its ordinary existence with a subtlety that rendered it indistinguishable from its surroundings. Windows glowed and dimmed according to habit. Doors opened and closed without hesitation. The study remained undisturbed, its drawer closed not out of intention, but because there was no longer a reason to open it without purpose. The watch rested in silence, measuring time without demanding attention. Edmund did not return to the house again. He believed that closure, once achieved, should not be revisited. To do so would be to risk reintroducing meaning where none remained. The owner, relieved without ceremony, resumed his routines gradually, no longer attentive to the absence that had briefly unsettled him. In time, even the memory of disturbance softened, blending into the broader rhythm of days that pass without remark. We continued our walks through London, though now without reference to the case. The city, indifferent to resolution, offered its familiar comfort. Streets absorbed footsteps and released them again. Lamps illuminated nothing of importance. Sounds carried briefly and dissolved into the background of ordinary life. Edmund spoke little during this period. When he did, it was not of the case, but of the nature of continuity. He remarked that most lives are shaped not by moments of crisis, but by the quiet maintenance of balance. Disturbances occur, he said, not as exceptions, but as reminders that balance is an active condition rather than a fixed state. The watch, having returned, no longer represented loss or memory. It had resumed its role as a measure rather than a symbol. Edmund believed this transformation to be essential. Objects burdened with meaning must eventually be allowed to return to usefulness, or they risk distorting the present through persistent attachment to the past. As evenings passed, I found myself reflecting upon the manner in which this case had unfolded. There had been no pursuit, no accusation, no confrontation. Nothing had been proven, and nothing had been confessed. Yet resolution had occurred with a completeness that left no residue of doubt. Edmund regarded this outcome as ideal. He believed that justice, when applied too visibly, often disrupts more than it restores. Quiet correction, achieved without coercion, preserves dignity on all sides. The return of the watch had required no acknowledgement beyond its placement. It spoke for itself through silence. London continued unchanged. The square where habit had once revealed itself became merely another space through which people passed without pause. The man who had taken the watch returned to anonymity, his decision complete and his role concluded. Edmund did not consider this a failure of inquiry. He considered it a success of restraint. As we walked one evening beneath a sky softened by cloud, Edmund spoke of how such cases rarely linger in the mind. They conclude not with memory, but with absorption. The event becomes part of the background, indistinguishable from countless others that leave no mark upon history. He believed that this was as it should be. Time, he said, corrects itself most effectively when allowed to proceed without interruption. Attempts to hold it, reclaim it, or redirect it inevitably reveal their limitations. Acceptance, once reached, restores motion without resistance. The watch continued to mark the hours. The house remained whole. The city moved forward without awareness that anything had ever been unsettled. In recording this final chapter, I am mindful that the quietest resolutions are often the most enduring. They require no witness, no validation, and no retelling beyond what is necessary to understand them. They conclude gently, allowing those involved to return to the ordinary passage of life without alteration. Edmund Blackwood returned his attention to other matters, content to let this one fade without trace. He did not file it away as a success or a lesson. He allowed it to dissolve into the larger continuity of time, where it would neither intrude nor demand remembrance. As night settled once more over London, the city softened into its familiar stillness. Lamps glowed steadily. Windows dimmed one by one. The quiet accumulated, not as absence, but as rest. The case was complete. Nothing further remained to be observed. Nothing further required attention. And within that quiet continuity, time moved forward once more, uninterrupted, unremarked, and whole.